What's up, everybody? This is Christoforou with the Duran, and I'm here with Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran, and today we're going to be talking about Trump and NATO. All right, Alexander, the neocons, the warmongers, the neoliberal warmongers, the mainstream media, they're going crazy over the fact that Trump dared to, in conversation, probably talking to his advisors, maybe talking to Ivanka, Jared, who the hell knows, that he dared to discuss the viability of NATO. God forbid. But let's kick off this video. Let's start this video with someone that, we enjoy watching. Is probably the only mainstream media opinion journalist who dares to question the narrative, and that's Tucker Carlson. And Tucker Carlson had David Tafuri on, who's an Obama foreign policy advisor. So I think we know what to expect. Let's take a look at the video and their conversation, and then I would like your comments on it.
A huge story, or it would have been a huge story in 1983 when the Soviet Union still existed and it was still clear what the point of NATO was. NATO, you remember, was created to keep the Soviets from invading Western Europe, and NATO did a very good job of that all the way until the very day the Soviet Union collapsed. That was the summer of 1991. It was almost 28 years ago. Vladimir Putin runs Russia now. He does not plan to invade Western Europe. He can't. So why do we still have NATO? Well, nobody really knows. In Washington, you're definitely not allowed to ask. And that's a shame, because it would be an interesting conversation. Remaining in NATO comes with significant obligations. In the 1990s, our leaders decided it would be a wise idea to promise countries like Latvia and Estonia that we would use nuclear weapons to protect them if they ever had a problem with Russia. Why did we do that? Well, who knows? The details are lost to history. But the point is, we did that. Article 5 obligates the United States to protect any NATO ally that is threatened. So how do we feel about that now? Are you ready to launch a nuclear war over Latvia? What do you think of sending your kids to defend the territorial integrity of Estonia? Our foreign policy establishment thinks it's well worth it. In fact, under our current rules of membership in NATO, we would have no choice. You might not have known that. All of this might merit a national debate of some sort at some point when we're ready, 28 years in. But no, the left isn't into national debates anymore. They're into screaming and threats and criminal investigation and other forms of coercion. They like things the way they are in this country. They're benefiting hugely from the status quo, and they don't like being challenged. They consider asking difficult questions a criminal act. Just this morning, in fact, Preet Bharara, he's the most famous former federal prosecutor in the country, explained this view on Twitter. He said this, quote, "If true, Trump should immediately and publicly state his apparent wish to withdraw from NATO so he can be promptly impeached, convicted, and removed from office," unquote. In other words, talking about leaving NATO isn't simply unwise, according to our leaders. It's an impeachable offense. Lots of famous and powerful people in Washington think this. Watch.
Withdrawing from NATO, even discussion about withdrawing from NATO, I think would be disastrous for the security.
Rethinking membership in NATO isn't just treasonous and criminal, though obviously it is. It's also prima facie evidence of insanity. You're not fit to govern if you say that. You probably shouldn't drive a car, just in the interest of public safety. So whatever happened to the old Democratic Party? When did the anti-war people become florid neocons? When did it become the party of Bill Kristol and Max Boot and every other discredited hack still trying to replicate the Iraq disaster in nations around the world? Who knows when that happened, but that's exactly what the Democratic Party is today. Just ask Tulsi Gabbard. Gabbard is a Democratic member of Congress. She's now running for president. On most questions, she's a conventional liberal. She represents Hawaii, after all. Of course she is. But on the question of Syria, she's skeptical. Gabbard isn't eager to overthrow the Assad government. Why? Well, because she worries about what might come next, what might happen to the Christians, the many other religious minorities who live there. For saying that, for holding that position, she's being denounced today by the left as a monster. Just this morning, the Daily Beast tried to link her to David Duke, literally. The dumb people on TV are mad, too. Watch them.
She went in 2017, Gloria, this is going to be another issue, to visit with Bashar al-Assad in Syria. And this trip has already come back to bite her. She did apologize for this.
She did, but, you know, how many apologies can you make for bad judgment? Not only will she be criticized inside the Democratic Party, but I think it makes her a less effective candidate. I mean, you know, she can't position herself against Trump.
In Washington, just so you know, let's be crystal clear about this. You were not allowed to meet with foreign dictators. It's immoral. In fact, it might be treason. It could trigger the 25th Amendment, unless it's, I don't know, Xi Jinping of China. Yes, the Chinese government murders its political opponents. Yes, it has put Muslims in concentration camps. Yes, they're languishing in those camps right now. But it's not a huge deal to meet with the Chinese. The former governor of California, Jerry Brown, met with Xi just 2 years ago. He praised him as a leader in the fight against global climate change, even though China is, of course, by far the world's biggest polluter. But whatever. He may be a dictator, but he's a progressive dictator. And the left is not against those. It's definitely for those. In fact, they're role models, in case you haven't figured it out. David Tufuri is a lawyer and former foreign policy advisor to the Obama campaign, and he joins us tonight. Old enough to remember when it was the party of peace, now the party of mandatory war. So I'm just wondering, why shouldn't we have a debate about Article 5 in NATO, which obligates the United States and all members of NATO to defend the interests of other states? So why should we be on the hook for the territorial integrity of Estonia and Latvia? Seriously.
There's nothing wrong with having a debate. We're going to have one right now. I hope it'll be educational. It's important to note that NATO has been successful in the past as a military and intelligence sharing alliance, and also as an alliance of like-minded countries. You admitted that in your opening, that NATO was successful in defeating the Soviet Union, right?
Yes.
Now, NATO is still needed. History repeats itself. Putin's Russia is not the same as the Soviet Union, but it's trying to do some of the same things. It's trying to stamp out rule of law. It doesn't believe in freedom. It doesn't believe in free markets. It's trying to spread a vision of a kleptocracy that will enrich Putin and enrich the other oligarchs. That's what they have in Russia, and they're trying to spread it to the rest of Europe.
That's right. I mean, but how is that different from China? Only in that it's less effective. So I don't think that Russia has taken over Africa or Latin America yet, or the Caribbean. China has. Well, but it's totally fine. It's totally fine to get rich from sucking up to Chinese oligarchs. Our whole ruling class does. But it's wrong not to defend Latvia against Putin, because why?
No, you're right. I mean,
NATO
is also an alliance that's aligned against China in many ways as well.
No,
so what's comparing Russia to China doesn't somehow make what Russia's doing okay.
No. What you're describing, you're trying to explain why it's in America's vital interest to start a nuclear war to defend Latvia.
No, I did not say that.
Well, that's what we'd be obligated to do.
It's in America's vital interest to defend other countries around the world that are trying to become democracies, that are trying to promote freedom, that are trying to promote individual rights. They're trying to protect human rights and, most importantly, protect rule of law. That's what Latvia, the other Baltic states that have joined NATO successfully are doing, and we should encourage that by extending that security umbrella to them, which is what NATO has done.
So in other words, our kids get to die for Latvia because it somehow protects the rule of law for them to do that. And I'm just asking, does the average American understand that we're on the hook for this? I think that's a real question, which is trying to be ignored. They're trying to shut down the conversation.
You have to look at history. If Latvia and the other Baltic states fall to an aggressive Russia, ultimately other countries in Europe will fall. And ultimately, it will come back to us anyway, just like World War II. It's these same arguments people made against in favor of not doing anything against Germany and the Nazis in World War II. The exact same argument you just made is what pacifists argue.
I'm not actually making that argument.
Yes, you are.
The Nazis don't exist, and neither does the Soviet Union. I'm making an argument rooted in 2019, which is where we are right now. And I'm interested, very interested, since you brought it up, in what Western European countries do you think are at threat of being invaded by Russia?
Well, certainly the countries that have recently joined NATO, the Baltic states are a threat. That's why you brought them up. Other countries that are not yet part of NATO, countries that are not yet part of NATO.
The core of Western Europe.
Okay, Ukraine is not part of NATO yet, right?
But the reason was part of the Soviet Union when I got married, like 20 minutes ago.
Yeah, but it wanted to be free, and now it is free.
Lots of people want to be free. I'm just saying,
and it deserves to be free.
But in Western Europe, what countries, the core countries of Western Europe, NATO exists? Poland is not a core country in Western Europe. Not to bring you back to, and I like Poland.
Okay, so you're willing to cede all of Eastern Europe,
I'm willing to cede
even the countries like Poland that are allies that are part of NATO, and say we should only protect Western Europe?
I'm asking
because
you sincerely,
once Eastern Europe goes, then Western Europe is threatened.
Okay, so you think there's I just want to, we're almost done. You think there's a plausible threat within our lifetimes of, say, the UK, Germany, Belgium, Liechtenstein, Switzerland, Spain, Portugal being invaded by Russia?
I am not saying that, but what I'm saying is
what you were saying.
If all of the other countries in Eastern Europe, including the ones that have joined NATO, fell, then of course the next frontier for Russia expansionism would be Western Europe.
Right. So first they came for
obvious,
Latvia.
I think.
Yeah. Not obvious at all to me, but.
All right, Alexander, that was David Tafuri. The first, my comment is, Tucker, why do you bring such idiots on your show? Because, and I'll say a couple of things that he mentioned, which I find funny, and then you can break down his commentary on why NATO is so essential and why Trump committed the ultimate sin by discussing NATO. The guy, David Tafuri, says that Russia is still a threat to the Baltic nations, that Russia poses and posed a threat to Ukraine, which is not even a member of NATO, but it wants to be a member of NATO. So the U.S. needs to defend it and NATO needs to defend it. He also said that Russia is a kleptocracy that looks to enrich oligarchs. And this is coming from a guy that was with the Obama administration, a neoliberal administration that did nothing more than create war and enrich the oligarchs. And he says that Russia doesn't believe in capitalism and free markets, which I find extremely odd. But I think Russia believes too much. And Putin's Russia believes too much in capitalism and the free markets. But anyway, Alexander, begin to destroy David Tafuri and his comments on NATO.
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right. Can I just make a point, very quick point about your last point? Many Russians also believe that Putin believes too much in capitalism and free markets. But coming back to that debate, I mean, I found it utterly surreal because the idea that the Russians are any kind of threat to the Baltic states or to Poland, I mean, it's just nonsense. I mean, it's just absolutely crazy stuff. And the idea that the United States would defend the Baltic states against Russia if we ever got to that kind of crisis and would commit nuclear suicide to do so is equally crazy. So, I mean, he is just talking absolute nonsense. The point about NATO is not that it is defending anybody from anything, certainly not from Russia. It can't possibly defend the Baltic states from Russia. You only have to look at a map to see why. The point about NATO is that it maintains a political and economic and military structure in Europe that benefits some people in the United States, but I question whether it benefits most of them. And Tucker Carlson is absolutely right to point that out. And may I add that Donald Trump, for his part, is absolutely right to question it if he does so privately, which it seems he has. And good for him.
Well, what is NATO's mission? And I'm sure Trump is saying the same thing, because Trump is probably sitting there saying, look at all this money, look at all these resources going into something that he's probably sitting there saying, I don't understand. What the hell is their mission about?
Well, I don't understand what the mission is about. I mean, the mission, as Tucker correctly said in the video, was to protect Western Europe. Western Europe, it's called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So let's, remember what the geographical area it was supposed to be confined to. It was to defend Western Europe from the Soviet Union. I mean, the United States having an interest in this because, of course, the United States is also an Atlantic power. And if Northern Europe, Northwest Europe, on the coastline of NATO had fallen under Soviet control, it could have posed a potential security danger to the United States. I mean, that was the logic of the Cold War. That is why the United States was involved in the Cold War. The idea that Russia today has any aspirations to conquer Northwest Europe is absolutely fantastic. The Russians, as anybody realizes who spends any time there, are overwhelmingly focused at this time on their own economic development. That is what Putin spends most of his time on. Certainly not plotting to conquer the Baltic states or Poland or let alone Belgium or Luxembourg or Liechtenstein, not to mention Britain or France or Norway or any of the other places. That is what they talk about most of the time. That's most of the people he meets. That's most of the subjects that get discussed in the Russian media, which, may I add, is far more open in discussing these sort of questions than the media in the United States is. I mean, it is a very, very bizarre thing to have a situation where, as Tucker Carlson said, to suggest that to talk in the United States about the United States leaving NATO is apparently practically a crime. And if you are president of the United States, could be seen as provoking use of the 25th Amendment. In other words, that you're insane and unfit to hold on. I mean, we have reached a very bad point when people talk in that way.
Tafuri, when he opened up the conversation with Tucker Carlson, he says, okay, we're going to have a debate and hopefully we're going to learn something. We're going to have a little bit of a history lesson. So let's get into a little bit of NATO's history, Alexander. And NATO, first of all, would you say that NATO Article 5 is in essence, the way it's written, a defensive pact? It's a defensive statement, Article 5. If you attack us, then we're going to attack you. Would that be correct to say that?
Well, it would be correct to say that. I mean, that is the principle. I should add that the language of Article 5 and of the NATO Charter is actually rather more qualified than people think. But the practical reality is that if a member of NATO is subject to armed aggression and the other members of NATO don't come to its rescue, then, I mean, NATO is dead, because without that happening, it's difficult to see how it can work.
Okay, so let's get into some of NATO's defensive actions. NATO and Serbia. What do you make of that?
Well, it wasn't a defensive action at all. It was an act of aggression. I mean, NATO attacked Serbia. It didn't defend anything. I mean, Serbia, Yugoslavia, actually, it was Yugoslavia at that time, was a sovereign country which wasn't threatening or attacking any other country. It had an internal conflict it was dealing with in one of its provinces, which was Kosovo. But it was certainly not attacking any NATO country in a way that justified invoking Article 5.
NATO and Libya.
Well, it's exactly the same. I mean, technically, of course, it wasn't NATO that attacked Libya. It was the United States and the usual coalition of the willing. But in practice, all the NATO machinery
which are all NATO
absolutely.
members.
Well, it goes beyond that, because, of course, many of the facilities of NATO were used in the attack on Libya. So, I mean, the simple fact is, Libya was not, to say that it wasn't attacked by NATO is a bit of a stretch also. So, and of course, Libya again wasn't attacking anybody. It was involved in an internal conflict. So that was again a war of aggression, like the war against Yugoslavia, one not authorized by the Security Council.
And two very dangerous instances which could have brought war between the United States and Russia, or NATO with Russia, are Georgia and Ukraine.
Well, in the case of Georgia, it's actually quite interesting, because you're quite right. What had happened was that there was a NATO summit meeting in, I think, Bucharest, early that year. That's in April 2008, where the United States, at that time, under the George W. Bush administration, tried to railroad Georgia and Ukraine into NATO. Some of the European states, led by Germany, strongly objected. That didn't happen. And sure enough, a few months later, Georgia attacked this territory of South Ossetia, provoking a Russian military reaction. Now, can I stress that is disputed by some people, but it has been confirmed by a study of the conflict commissioned by the European Union. And I don't think there's anybody who's followed it who doubts that that's what happened. And of course, what happened then as a result of that conflict is that an awful lot of people in Europe said, thank God Georgia wasn't in NATO, because what were we supposed to do in that situation? Come to its rescue when it had itself picked a quarrel with Russia?
And what about Ukraine, which is probably the most recent conflict, where NATO had its fingers, and I think it definitely had its fingers. It does have its fingers in Ukraine. There's no doubt. And of course, during the Tucker Carlson interview, Ukraine was mentioned prominently.
Indeed. I mean, I think Ukraine is the biggest and most scary example of them all, because frankly, the war in Ukraine that is actually underway in Ukraine now, the civil war we see in Ukraine, is because of the attempt to bring Ukraine into NATO. I mean, that was a red line, not just for the Russians, but for many people in Ukraine too. It was a red line for people in eastern Ukraine. It was a red line for people in Crimea, which is an overwhelmingly Russian-speaking territory. And of course, they looked at the sort of people within Ukraine who were advocating Ukraine's union with NATO, joining NATO, and they said very clearly, we do not want to be governed by them, especially if, with the support of NATO and the European Union, those people seized power undemocratically, unconstitutionally by force. So actually what happened in Ukraine is that the attempt to expand NATO into Ukraine provoked a war there and a crisis in international relations between the West and Russia, which could and should have been avoided.
Now, many people say, and I think this is a correct assumption and a correct observation, that NATO is intrinsically tied to the European Union, and the European Union is tied to NATO. The two are kind of, Siamese twins that go hand in hand. They walk in lockstep. Now, Trump doesn't have much love for the European Union. Some states in the European Union, the Mercouris, the Germanys, the Macrons, and the France, Trump doesn't like these guys very much. How much do you think that affects the way Trump looks at NATO as well, when he says, what are we doing dealing with NATO? Why do we have this thing? Because he sees things, he's a very big picture type of guy. And he kind of says, these EU rat pack guys, these neoliberal, rat pack, soy boy kind of, these leaders, I'm not too fond of them. And I know that they're tied to the hip with these NATO guys as well. What are we doing wasting time and resources on these guys?
I think that's exactly what he's saying. And can I just say about Donald Trump, I mean, he's often not the most effective president in executing his policies. But actually, if you look at his overall vision and understanding of the world, it is quite clear. It is clear in a way that his critics in the United States are not. And he's saying to himself, in what conceivable interest is it of the United States for the United States to be tied down to all these commitments in Europe, which is only creating problems for the United States with Russia, which is a country which it is in the interests of the United States to be friends with, because it is far more powerful and inherently much richer than these countries, and is now, as a result of our hostility, drifting into an alliance with China, which is our main adversary. I think that is how Donald Trump looks at this, and he looks at all these politicians in Europe, and as you quite rightly says, he's not impressed by them at all. And he's absolutely right. There's nothing very impressive about any of them. So he has a much better strategic grasp of the situation of the United States than his critics do. I think the big mistake his critics make when they look at this is that they are still, I think, stuck with the situation that the United States was in the 1990s, when China was still a much smaller economy than the United States, and Russia was in economic and political chaos, and the United States could do whatever it wanted and could push its weight around the world in whichever way it chose, and as a result never had to compromise on anything. And I think the people at that time, these people at that time, thought, you know, that if they expanded NATO even further into Eastern Europe and into Russia itself, and they ringed Russia with nuclear missiles and anti-ballistic missiles and pulled out of all these treaties, they would subordinate Russia even more and perhaps, who knows, even break it up. And that would in the end be the policy that would work to the US advantage. Now, whatever the morality of that policy, the point is it has failed, and clinging on to it is completely misconceived. And I think it's essential for the United States to rethink this. And it's good to see people like Tucker Carlson and indeed Donald Trump, the President of the United States, rethinking it. And it is extremely dangerous that there are people like James Clapper, who you also see briefly on this program, implying that it's somehow a thought crime, or indeed even an actual crime, to think about these big strategic questions at all. Doing so is only going to compound the United States' overcommitment crisis. In other words, pitching the United States in cold wars with Russia and China at one and the same time, which even the United States military accepts, that the United States going down the line is not going to have the resources to do.
Right, and Clapper did speak out against Trump's
yeah, absolutely. I mean, he does
to discuss NATO. Yeah,
he does it all the time. He's on that program. If you see him, he's one of the people who's interviewed. I mean, it's quite bizarre listening to him. And as I said, it's time when, again, as Tucker Carlson absolutely rightly said, we should stop listening to the Max Boots and the Crystals and all these, the Kagans and all these very strange neoconservative people whose policies still are those of the 1990s and early 2000s, which is a moment which has now passed. I mean, the United States...
He's right to say they destroyed the world, too, these guys.
They destroyed the world. I mean, they created chaos. They failed then when the United States was stronger relative to China and Russia than it is now. And they're not going to succeed now when, as I said, the United States is weaker relative to China and Russia than it is now. So, I mean, you know, it's pointless pursuing these policies anymore. And the way in which these people, as I say, suggest that anybody who criticizes them and criticizes the commitments to the indefinite commitment to NATO that they are insisting on, are committing treason in some ways, I think that is extremely dangerous.
Would it be fair to say that the real kleptocracy, the real oligarchy, are these neocons and is NATO itself? And Trump probably realizes that. The real corruption, the real problem here is NATO and these neocons that are pushing this NATO apparatus all the way towards Russia's borders and even beyond in some instances.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you're quite right. I mean, there is, one of the points I would say is that, we've both been to Russia many times. There is no constituency in Russia that wants confrontation with the West. I mean, there are lots of people who now see that as unavoidable and have come to accept it as a reality. But Putin himself, when he became leader of Russia in the early 2000s, wanted a partnership with the West. You only have to go back and look at not just what he was saying at that time, but things he was doing, like helping the United States defeat Al-Qaeda and the Taliban in Afghanistan after the 9/11 attacks, to see that. So, there is no constituency for confrontation in Russia. Nobody in Russia makes vast amounts of money from producing arms. I mean, the arms industries in Russia, the people who make the armaments there, are state-owned. These are nationalized industries. So there is no constituency of that kind in Russia. There is, unfortunately, in the United States, there is this terrifying nexus which brings together the big arms companies, Lockheed and Boeing and all of them, Raytheon, all of those, There is sections of the military who, as I said, are especially the generals, not I think so much the middle-ranking officers, who want, who's still stuck with the kind of world that they knew from the Cold War. There's these neocon ideologues, and I'm sorry to say it, there's also a large numbers of people, some in the Republican Party, many more in the Democratic Party, who still think that, it's 1994, and the United States can go on doing what it wants. And if we don't do that, somehow the world will collapse. And we won't have the United States as the central power. And anybody in the United States who questioned this, like Donald Trump, is a traitor and possibly an agent of the Kremlin. I mean, it's when you talk about an oligarchy, a people who are unaccountable and who are driving the US's foreign policy. Yes, I agree. Look at the United States first and foremost, not at Russia.
Yeah, look at the mainstream media as well. 95% of the mainstream media are bought and paid for to promote the war machine.
Absolutely. And the armies of lobbyists who exist in Washington. Yeah. Nothing similar, again, I should stress, in Russia. There's nothing like that there. I mean, it's a much simpler political system in Russia than the one that you see in the United States now. And that's the reality of it. I mean, that's the other thing. I mean, one of the other things that came across to me as so surreal about that debate on Tucker Carlson's, it was a debate. I mean, it sounded to me like two people talking past each other, actually. But I mean, one of the things about it was, again, the extraordinary ignorance that there is about Russian realities. I mean, talk about kleptocracies and things like that. Russia was a kleptocracy in the 1990s. It isn't that anymore. Anybody who spends any time there can see that for themselves. That's not to say there isn't, a corruption problem there. But, there is corruption in many countries, including, of course, as you said, in the United States. Let's not get, completely worked up about this.
Yeah, there was, I think the general ignorance of the conversation was stunning. I think Tucker himself was shocked at the ignorance displayed. And
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think you're completely correct about that. I mean, the ignorance is astonishing, and the arrogance. And can I just say, I mean, all that talk about, defending the Baltic states. The reality is there is no threat to the Baltic states from Russia. But if there was, they are undefendable, and the United States wouldn't defend them, nor would people in Britain, nor would people in Germany. People are not going to die for Estonia. I mean, it is unrealistic to think that. And by bringing Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania into NATO, they are in a way hostages, because hostages of NATO. Because if as I said, if there were ever a situation where Russia were to attack them, of which perish the thought, then NATO would be exposed as a paper tiger, because it wouldn't be able to defend them, and it wouldn't defend them. So, I mean, that was a major strategic mistake anyway, and its only effect has been to increase hostility between the Baltic states and Russia, and entrench in the Baltic states anti-Russian politicians against the best interests of the Baltic peoples.
Yeah, and Russia has no interest whatsoever in swallowing up those states. There's nothing there for Russia.
Nothing there for Russia.
Nothing in. And even countries like Latvia and Lithuania are undergoing massive migration issues, and that people are leaving those countries to go work and live in the European Union, especially the UK.
Well, indeed so. I mean, that's exactly right. I mean, a correct policy for the Baltic states is not this policy of hostility and suspicion of Russia, which their governments are following. It is a policy of rapprochement with Russia. After all, Russia is their big neighbor. They should be working to be friends with Russia, as Finland did after the Second World War. And if they did that, they would be more prosperous countries and happier ones, and the state situation in Europe would be more peaceful. And it would have been far better if they never joined NATO and had followed that policy, which would have ensured their safety much better than everything else that we've actually seen.
Yeah, and now you have the deep state apparatus just, scared out of their, scared to crap that you're going to have someone like Trump tear it all down. Or I even dare to mention that he has a different world view, a different global view, and is even considering tearing down what is a massive, massive kleptocracy.
Well, this is exactly right, because I mean, this is why the reaction has been so virulent, because of course they don't actually have a coherent reason for sustaining NATO. Here is Donald Trump, the President of the United States, and no less, pointing that out to them. And of course it's driving them mad. And that's why we have all these threats to impeach people, to treat people as criminals or traitors if they think these things. In fact, all that Donald Trump was thinking and Tucker Carlson was saying is the obvious. And it's time people accepted this. It's time, as Donald Trump and Tucker Carlson said, that the political class in the United States starts acting in the interests of the United States, not on these megalomaniac projects that a bunch of neocons have, which has, as you correctly said, Alex, simply created disaster everywhere that they've been applied.
Yeah, that's what makes Trump so relatable. He says such obvious things that are, that's in everyone's mind. Why the hell are we dealing with NATO? Why is our money going to this thing? It's just common sense. And Trump blurts it out. He says it.
Well, he did. Yeah, I mean, I think this is exactly the point. And I mean, I think what really, with Donald Trump, it's not just that he's thinking these things. It's exactly as you said, Alex, that he has so much traction when he does so. People in the United States are listening to him. And of course, they're thinking the same things that he does. And if we go back to that program, I mean, again, when people look at Europe, Western Europe, this rich and large continent, 300, 400 million people, the idea that it cannot defend itself against Russia, if there really was such a threat from Russia, which of course there isn't, is a ridiculous one. And again, Donald Trump is right to point it out.
Yes, he is. Alexander Mercouris, Editor-in-Chief of the Duran. Thank you very much. Guys, if you like this video, click the subscribe button down below and click on the notifications bell to get notifications every time we push out a new video. Visit the Duran shop, pick up a t-shirt, donate to us on PayPal and Patreon. The links are in the description box down below. And go to theduran.com and see all the articles that Alexander is linking up to every day. And don't forget, guys, you can get a copy of this show in audio format on iTunes and SoundCloud. Alexander Mercouris, Editor-in-Chief of the Duran. Thank you very much. Until next time, take care.